The jet lurched hard enough to rattle the overhead panels, and the captain's voice cut through the cabin before anyone had time to breathe. Hold position. Engines idle. People froze, seatbelts half-fastened, hands hovering in mid-air. On the forward left seat, a white-haired man in a tailored navy blazer pointed down the aisle and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "She does not belong up here. Fix this. Now." The private charter sat motionless on the runway at Westchester County Airport, grey morning light bleeding through the oval windows. Rain streaked sideways, sharp and relentless, tapping the fuselage like impatient fingers. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and burnt coffee. No one spoke. Everyone listened. Margaret Lewis stood in the aisle with her palm pressed lightly against the back of a cream-colored seat, steadying herself. She was 58. Her shoulders were squared. Her breathing was slow, measured, practiced, the kind of breathing you learn when panic has no place to land. She wore a dark wool coat, plain, well-used, the cuff softened with age. No jewelry, no visible symbols of power. Just a woman who looked like she'd spent a lifetime learning when not to react. The man who'd pointed at her sat back down with a grunt of irritation. His name was Richard Hale. 62. Venture partner. The kind of man who believed his voice carried authority, because it always had. His silver watch flashed as he crossed his arms, jaw-tight eyes, sharp with triumph. He had taken the seat minutes earlier, sliding into it without asking, as if ownership was something you could claim by force of habit. "You told me this was resolved," Richard said to the flight attendant, not looking at Margaret. "We're already late. This is unacceptable." Susan Carter stood near the galley, her posture rigid. Mid-40s. Years in private aviation had taught her how to read a cabin the way a surgeon reads a monitor. Right now, everything was spiking. She glanced from Richard to Margaret, then down at the tablet in her hands, her lips pressed together. She didn't answer right away. A man across the aisle shifted in his seat. He wore a charcoal sweater, wedding ring eyes darting. He whispered to his wife. "Did she do something?" The wife shook her head, unsure, her fingers gripping the armrest. Margaret said nothing. She hadn't said much since boarding. She had taken the seat assigned to her by the operations team, set her bag down carefully, and closed her eyes as the engines warmed. She had felt the familiar ache behind her temples, the dull pressure that came from too many nights without sleep. She had promised herself this flight would be quiet. Just 90 minutes in the air. Enough time to breathe before the meeting, waiting on the other coast. Then Richard Hale boarded. He had come in loud already, mid-call, voice bouncing off the cabin walls, as if the space were built to carry him. He had looked at Margaret once. Just once. His eyes had slid over her coat, her shoes, the worn leather tote at her feet. Something in his expression had tightened. Not confusion. Decision. That seat, he'd said, ending the call without apology. "I need it." Margaret had opened her eyes slowly. She had looked at him, not up, not down. Straight on. "This is the seat I was assigned." Richard had laughed, short and humorless. "No. This seat is for principals. Move to the back." Susan had stepped in, then voice calm, hands open. "Sir, on this charter seating is flexible. We ask passengers to coordinate. I've been coordinating longer than you've been flying," Richard snapped. He turned back to Margaret. "I don't know who you are, but I'm not sitting behind someone like you." The words had landed hard, not shouted. Sharper than that. Margaret had felt them register in the cabin, felt the temperature change. She had glanced toward the cockpit door, then at the clock on the bulkhead. The departure window was tight, A delay would mean losing their slot. She knew the math. She always knew the math. So she stood, slowly, carefully. She lifted her bag, nodded once to Susan, and moved toward the rear without another word. Not because she agreed, because she chose the larger problem to solve. Richard had smiled then. A thin, satisfied smile. He had settled into the seat like a man reclaiming property. He had unbuckled the belt and stretched his legs, exhaling as if order had been restored. Now the plane sat still on the runway, engines quiet, rain pounding, the captain waiting. Susan cleared her throat. "Sir," she said to Richard, "we need to pause. There's been a report." Richard rolled his eyes. About what? Her feelings. "It's about conduct," Susan said, voice steady but tight, and safety. Margaret finally turned. Her face was calm, but her eyes had gone cold, focused on something deeper than the argument unfolding. She looked past Richard, past the watching passengers toward the small red light glowing near the ceiling. The cabin camera. Standard on this aircraft, always recording during ground operations. She thought of her father standing in a union hall decades earlier, hands folded, saying nothing while men underestimated him. She thought of the lesson he'd taught her without words. Choose your moment. Let them reveal themselves. Richard shifted in his seat, irritated. "This is ridiculous. I'm missing a call because you can't keep people in their place." That was when the captain's voice came again, lower now controlled. "Cabin crew status." Susan straightened. "Captain, we have a passenger dispute that escalated. We are holding until resolved." Margaret inhaled slowly. The plane hummed beneath her feet, a restrained animal. She could feel the eyes on her now. Curious, judgmental, uncertain. This was no longer about a seat. It hadn't been for a while. The jet remained motionless, rain blurring the outside world as the first crack appeared in the story everyone thought they understood. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, the kind that made people shift in their seats and check imaginary notifications. Rain continued to hammer the fuselage, steady and unforgiving, like a clock that refused to stop ticking. The jet still hadn't moved. No taxi, no clearance, just wait and waiting. Richard Hale leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice lowered, but edged with irritation. "Captain," he said toward the closed cockpit door, "this delay is unnecessary. I have a board call scheduled. If we miss the window, that's on you." Susan Carter didn't respond immediately. She stepped into the aisle, her shoes barely making a sound on the carpet. Her eyes went to Margaret, then away again, torn between protocol and instinct. She had worked private charters long enough to recognize patterns. Entitlement had a smell. It lingered. So Susan said finally, "I need you to remain seated." Richard scoffed. "I am seated. That's the problem. She should have been told to move sooner." Across the aisle, the man in the charcoal sweater cleared his throat. "Actually," he said quietly, surprising even himself, she did move. Without arguing, Richard shot him a look. "This doesn't concern you." The man shrank back, chastened. His wife squeezed his hand under the armrest, eyes fixed forward. No one else spoke. No one wanted to be next. Margaret stood near the rear bulkhead, now one hand resting against the cool metal wall. She felt the vibration of the aircraft through her palm, subtle but constant. Her bag sat at her feet, the leather scuffed at the corners, softened by years of use. She hadn't bought it for status. She'd bought it because it held up, because it lasted. She replayed the last few minutes in her mind, not with anger, but with clarity. Richard's tone, his word choice, The way he'd looked past Susan, past everyone, straight through her. The way men like him always assumed the world would rearrange itself to keep them comfortable. Susan approached her quietly. "Miss Lewis," she said under her breath, careful not to draw attention, "I'm going to need to ask you a few questions." Margaret nodded once. "Of course." They stepped a few feet toward the galley, voices low. Susan kept her body angled a shield against wandering eyes. "One of the passengers reported that Mr. Hale made physical contact with your belongings." Margaret's gaze didn't flicker. "He did." Susan inhaled slowly. "Can you tell me what happened?" "He followed me back here," Margaret said. "He was irritated that I was still on the plane. He said I was blocking access. Then he kicked my bag." Susan's jaw tightened. "Hard. Yes." Susan glanced toward the forward cabin, where Richard sat, oblivious, checking his phone, like a man convinced time would bend for him. "Did he say anything else?" Margaret paused. Just a fraction of a second. Enough to choose accuracy over drama. "He told me people like me shouldn't expect courtesy in spaces we didn't earn." Susan closed her eyes briefly. Not in disbelief, in recognition. "I need to document this," Susan said, "and I need to inform the captain." Margaret nodded again. "I understand." As Susan turned away, Margaret's eyes lifted to the cabin camera once more. The small red light glowed steadily. Unblinking. Patient. Up front, Richard shifted annoyance, deepening into something sharper. He didn't like delays. He didn't like uncertainty. He especially didn't like the feeling that control was slipping in a room where he expected obedience. He leaned into the aisle and snapped his fingers. "Susan, this is getting absurd." Susan stopped but didn't turn around. "So please lower your voice." Richard laughed, loud and brittle. "You're lecturing me now?" After she caused this mess. The word she hung in the air, heavy and pointed. Margaret felt it land not just on her, but on the room. She felt the eyes again, the calculations, who mattered, who didn't. Susan turned then, slowly. "Sir," she said, and her voice had changed, "you're going to need to cooperate." "Or what?" The question came out too fast, too careless. "Or this flight will not depart," Susan said. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Someone exhaled sharply. A woman 2 rows back whispered, "Oh my God." Richard stood abruptly, the movement sudden enough to make the man beside him flinch. "You're threatening me over a bag." Susan didn't move. "I'm enforcing safety." Richard stepped into the aisle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, used to rooms parting when he entered. "This is harassment," he said, pointing toward the rear. "She's playing victim." Margaret met his eyes then, really met them. Her expression was unreadable, calm, controlled. But there was something else there now, a depth that made Richard hesitate, just for a moment. "Sit down," Susan said, sharper now. Richard didn't. That was when the cockpit door opened. Captain Daniel Mercer stepped out, his presence immediate, grounded. Early 50s, former military, the kind of man whose authority didn't announce itself, it settled. He took in the scene in one sweep, the standing passenger, the tense crew, the woman by the bulkhead. "What's going on?" he said, voice even. Richard spoke first. "Captain, this is being mishandled. I paid for priority seating, and I'm being delayed because a passenger is making accusations." Daniel's eyes didn't leave him. "Sir, return to your seat." Richard hesitated, then complied, dropping back into the chair with a huff. Daniel turned to Susan. "Report." Susan spoke clearly. Passenger Hale forcibly displaced another passenger from her assigned seat, followed her to the rear, and kicked her personal property. "We have a witness report and cabin footage." Daniel's gaze shifted to Margaret. He studied her face, her posture. He didn't see agitation. He saw restraint. "Is that accurate?" he asked her. "Yes," Margaret said simply. Daniel nodded. "Were you injured?" "No." He turned back to Richard. "Sir, did you kick her bag?" Richard scoffed at it. "I nudged it. It was in the way." Daniel held his stare. "That's not an answer." A beat passed. 2. Richard looked away first. "Fine. I touched it." "This is still being blown out of proportion." Daniel straightened. "This aircraft does not move with unresolved safety issues. You're grounding us because of her," Richard snapped. "No," Daniel said. "Because of you." The words fell hard. Final. Margaret felt something shift then. Not relief. Not triumph. Alignment. The pieces sliding into place. Daniel keyed his radio. "Ground hold position. We are returning to stand." Richard shot to his feet again. "You can't do that. We're cleared." Daniel didn't raise his voice. "Watch me." The jet remained still, engines quiet, rain relentless, as the runway lights reflected in the windows like a warning. Somewhere behind Margaret, someone whispered, "This just got real." And it had. The jet began to roll backward, at a crawl, tires humming against wet pavement, the sensation subtle but unmistakable. Forward momentum died. The illusion of inevitability broke. People felt it in their stomachs before they understood it in their heads. This flight was not going anywhere. Richard Hale gripped the armrests as if the chair itself had betrayed him. "This is insane," he said louder now, voice cracking against the low ceiling. "You don't get to punish everyone because of a misunderstanding." Captain Mercer didn't look at him. He kept his eyes forward, one hand resting on the doorframe, the other on the radio. "Sir, I've made my decision." "What decision?" Richard demanded. "You haven't even heard my side." "I have," Daniel said. "I watched it." The words landed heavier than any accusation. Richard's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced up toward the ceiling, toward the camera he'd ignored until now. For the first time since boarding, uncertainty flickered across his face. Around them, the cabin shifted. A woman near the window pulled her coat tighter, as if the temperature had dropped. The man in the charcoal sweater stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, breathing shallow. Someone in the back whispered a prayer they hadn't said in years. Susan Carter moved with purpose, now every step deliberate. She spoke quietly into her headset, relaying details to ground operations, choosing her words with care. Years of training surfaced the part of her that knew moments like this defined careers. She glanced once at Margaret, who stood where she'd been since the captain arrived, still composed, hands relaxed at her sides. Margaret felt the backward motion stop. The aircraft settled. The rain sounded louder now, drumming against the skin of the plane. She could smell damp concrete through the vents. She could feel the eyes again, not sharp this time, but searching. People wanted to know who she was, why this had escalated so far, why the captain had drawn such a hard line. She gave them nothing. Richard stood again, unable to help himself. "You're really doing this," he said, disbelief bleeding into anger. "You're turning this into a spectacle." Daniel turned, then slowly. "Sit down." Richard didn't. His chest rose and fell too fast. "You think you're some hero," he said, pointing past Daniel toward Margaret, protecting her. "You have no idea who I am." Susan stepped between them, hands raised. "Sir, please. I generate more revenue in a quarter than this entire operation," Richard continued. "People like me keep these planes in the air." Margaret felt a familiar sensation, one she'd known since her early career. Not fear, not shame. Recognition. The moment when someone revealed exactly how they measured worth. Daniel's voice cut through it. "Last warning," Richard laughed, sharp and brittle. "Or what? You'll throw me off my own flight." Daniel didn't answer. He reached for the intercom instead. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice steady, carrying through the cabin for safety reasons, this aircraft has returned to stand. Please remain seated until further instruction. A collective exhale moved through the cabin. Phones came out, then were tucked away, again uncertain. No one wanted to be caught recording the wrong thing. Richard's face flushed deep red. He turned toward Margaret, eyes blazing. "You think you've won something?" Margaret met his gaze. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet. "This isn't a competition." That only enraged him further. "Of course you'd say that he snapped. You get to hide behind politeness, while people like me do the real work." Susan's patience snapped. "Sir," she said sharply, "you are escalating this situation. Because you let her manipulate you." Richard shot back. The word manipulate echoed ugly and loaded. Daniel stepped forward. He was close enough now that Richard could see the lines around his eyes, the calm that came from command, not arrogance. "Sir," he said, "you are now interfering with crew operations." Richard froze. The phrase meant something. He knew enough law to recognize the line being drawn. "That's a serious allegation," Richard said, voice lowering. "So is kicking someone's property on an aircraft," Daniel replied. A man near the aisle spoke up, voice shaky but clear. "I saw it." He kicked her bag. Silence followed. Heads turned. The witness swallowed hard, then continued, emboldened by his own words. "I didn't say anything before because I didn't want trouble. But I saw it." Richard spun toward him. "You're lying." The man's wife squeezed his arm. "He's not," she said softly. Susan nodded. "We have that noted." Richard looked around, suddenly aware that the room had shifted. The invisible math he'd always relied on was changing. Numbers he couldn't see were being tallied. Outside, the sound of approaching vehicles cut through the rain. Tires on tarmac. Doors slamming. Someone near the window craned their neck. "Are those security trucks?" Margaret followed the sound, her expression unchanged. She had known this was coming the moment Daniel keyed the radio. Processes were like gravity. Once engaged, they pulled everything with them. Richard heard it too. His confidence wavered, then hardened into defiance. "This is absurd," he said louder now, as if volume could restore order. "I will have your job for this." Daniel didn't flinch. "You're welcome to file a complaint." Susan glanced at Daniel, then back at Margaret. "Ms. Lewis," she said quietly, "would you be willing to provide a statement?" Margaret nodded. "Of course." Richard laughed again, but there was no humor in it. "Listen to yourselves." "Over a seat." Margaret turned to him fully now. Her eyes were steady, her tone even. It was never about the seat. For a moment, something like doubt crossed Richard's face. He opened his mouth to respond, then stopped as a knock sounded at the forward door. Two figures appeared through the small window silhouettes against flashing amber lights. Airport security. Calm, methodical, unhurried. Susan moved to the door, exchanged a few words through the intercom, then opened it. Cool air rushed in, carrying the smell of rain and fuel. The sound of the runway flooded the cabin. A uniformed officer stepped inside, scanning the room. "Which passenger is Richard Hale?" Richard straightened, chin lifting. "That's me." The officer nodded. "Sir, we need you to come with us." For what? Richard demanded. "An incident report," the officer said. "You're not under arrest at this time." Richard looked around, searching for allies. He found none. The man in the charcoal sweater avoided his gaze. The woman by the window stared at her hands. Even Susan had stepped back, expression professional, distant. Richard turned to Margaret one last time. "You did this." Margaret didn't respond. As Richard was escorted toward the door, the cabin held its breath. His footsteps echoed loud in the narrow aisle. Just before he stepped out, he looked back, eyes burning. This isn't over. Margaret watched him go, rain soaking his expensive jacket the moment he crossed the threshold. She felt no satisfaction, only resolve. The door closed, the cabin sealed again. Silence returned heavier, now layered with consequence. Daniel exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "We'll wait for clearance." Margaret leaned back against the bulkhead, eyes closing for the first time since boarding. The storm outside showed no sign of stopping. Neither did the story unfolding inside that plane. The runway lights blurred into long white streaks as the jet sat idle engines cooling the storm pressing in from every direction. Time stretched differently now. Not rushed, not suspended. Measured. The kind of waiting that forces people to confront what they'd rather ignore. Margaret remained near the rear, her back against the bulkhead, eyes closed but mind fully awake. She listened to the sounds of the cabin recalibrating itself after shock. A seat creaked. Someone cleared their throat. A phone buzzed, quickly silenced. The absence of Richard Hale left a vacuum that no one rushed to fill. Susan Carter moved down the aisle with careful steps, checking on the passengers, her voice low and professional. "We appreciate your patience," she said more than once. Her eyes lingered briefly on Margaret, each time a mixture of concern and something else. Respect, maybe. Or curiosity. The man in the charcoal sweater finally exhaled. "I've never seen anything like that," he murmured to his wife. She nodded. "Neither have I." Her gaze drifted toward Margaret, then away, unsure what she was allowed to feel. Up front, Captain Mercer remained in the cockpit, coordinating with ground control, his tone clipped and precise. Procedures were being followed, reports logged, video flagged, everything documented. He trusted the process. He always had. But even he couldn't ignore the tension humming through the aircraft, the sense that something larger had been set in motion. Margaret opened her eyes and looked down at her hands. Steady. No tremor. She hadn't realized how accustomed she was to moments like this until now. Boardrooms, courtrooms, rooms where the air thickened and people waited for her to react. She had learned long ago that stillness unnerved people more than anger ever could. Susan stopped beside her. "Ms. Lewis," she said quietly. "Security would like to take a brief statement when you're ready." Margaret inclined her head. "I'm ready." They stepped toward the galley out of the direct line of sight. Susan spoke first, her voice softer. "I'm sorry," she said, "for how that unfolded." Margaret studied her face, the faint crease between her brows, the tension she hadn't yet released. "You handled it appropriately," Margaret said. "You did your job." Susan hesitated. "Not everyone would have stayed as calm as you did." Margaret's lips pressed together, not quite a smile. "I've had practice." The security officer waited just beyond the galley tablet in hand. He asked questions in a measured tone. What was said? What was done? Where it happened? Margaret answered plainly without embellishment. Facts only. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't soften it either. When it was over, the officer nodded. "Thank you for your cooperation, ma'am." Margaret returned to her spot, the exchange leaving a subtle shift behind. The cabin seemed to lean toward her, now listening even when she was silent. Minutes passed. Then more. The rain intensified, drumming harder, as if urging the jet to decide its fate. A notification chimed softly from the cockpit. Susan glanced at the display near the galley, then looked back at Margaret. "We've been given a revised window," she said. "But there's a hold." "How long?" Margaret asked. "Indefinite at the moment." Margaret closed her eyes again. The ache behind them pulsed, dull and insistent. She thought of the meeting waiting on the other coast, the faces around the table, the questions that would be asked, the assumptions that would already be forming. A younger man, 2 rows up, leaned into the aisle. "Excuse me," he said to Susan. "Are we still flying today?" Susan gave him a careful smile. "That's the plan." He nodded, unsatisfied but resigned. "Just checking." Margaret listened to the exchange, aware of the ripple effect one person's behavior could have on dozens of lives. Delays, missed connections, altered schedules. People would blame the storm, or the system. Few would ever understand the true cause. A low rumble vibrated through the cabin as a ground vehicle passed nearby. Red lights flashed briefly across the windows, then disappeared. Somewhere out there, Richard Hale was likely arguing, his case convinced the world would eventually see things his way. Margaret felt no urge to correct that assumption. Truth had a way of surfacing when given enough time. Susan returned again, this time with a bottle of water. She handed it to Margaret without a word. Margaret accepted it, their fingers brushing briefly. Susan's hand was cold. "Thank you," Margaret said. Susan lingered. "I don't know if this matters," she said, choosing her words, "but the captain wanted you to know that the decision to return was his." Margaret looked at her. Of course it was. Susan seemed relieved by the answer. The cabin settled into a strange quiet. Not peaceful, watchful. People stared out windows or at the backs of seats, thoughts turning inward. A woman near the aisle dabbed at her eyes, overwhelmed by something she couldn't quite name. The man in the charcoal sweater sat straighter now, as if witnessing the consequences of silence had shifted something in him. Margaret observed it all without comment. She felt the weight of their glances, the unspoken questions. Who was she? Why had the captain listened? Why had security responded so quickly? She let the questions hang. Answers came later. They always did. The cockpit door opened briefly, then closed again. Captain Mercer's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your continued patience. We are coordinating with ground control and will update you shortly." The word "shortly" carried little promise, but it was enough to keep the cabin from tipping into frustration. Margaret leaned her head back, eyes tracing the faint seam in the ceiling. She thought about how quickly a story could form around a moment like this, how easily narratives bent toward convenience. She had spent her life navigating those currents, correcting course when necessary, letting others run aground when they refused to listen. Another vibration rippled through the floor, then stilled. The rain began to ease its rhythm, softening like a held breath, finally released. Light shifted beyond the windows, the grey thinning just enough to suggest change. Susan's voice reached her again, quieter now. "Miss Lewis, she said the captain would like a word when you're ready." Margaret opened her eyes. She rose, smoothly joints, protesting only slightly. She gathered her bag, feeling the familiar weight settle against her side. As she moved toward the front, heads turned openly now. No hostility, no judgment, just attention. She stopped at the cockpit door, waiting. The moment hovered, suspended between what had happened and what was about to be revealed. Outside, the storm began to break. Inside, the air tightened, charged with expectation. Whatever came next, it would not be small. The cockpit was quieter than the cabin, insulated from the noise and emotion behind it, lit by muted panels and the soft glow of instruments. Captain Mercer turned in his seat as Margaret stepped inside his expression, neutral but attentive, the kind of focus that came from years of making decisions that carried weight long after the moment passed. "Thank you for coming forward," he said. His voice was calm, controlled. "I wanted to speak with you directly before we proceed." Margaret nodded once and took the jump seat opposite him. She placed her bag at her feet, hands resting lightly on her knees. She did not look around. She did not ask why. She waited. Daniel studied her for a beat longer than necessary. He had seen every kind of passenger in his career, loud ones, quiet ones, important ones who made sure everyone knew it. The woman in front of him was none of those things, and yet the cabin had shifted around her like iron filings around a magnet. "We've reviewed the preliminary footage," he said, "and the crew statements." Margaret inclined her head. "I understand." Daniel glanced at the co-pilot, who busied himself with a checklist, deliberately giving them space. "The behavior we observed from Mr. Hale meets the threshold for disruptive conduct," Daniel continued. "We are within our authority to deny him further transport." Margaret's expression didn't change. "That's your decision." "It is," Daniel said. "But I want to be clear. This return to stand will cause delays. There will be questions. Some of them will come to you." Margaret met his eyes. "I'm aware." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Most passengers in your position would already be calling attorneys, or demanding statements." Margaret's mouth curved faintly. Not a smile. Recognition. Most passengers in my position would not have been asked to move in the first place. Daniel nodded. "That's true." A brief silence followed. The hum of auxiliary power filled it steady and low. Outside the cockpit windows, rain streaked down, blurring the runway lights into pale smears. "I need to ask you something," Daniel said. "Off the record." Margaret's gaze sharpened. "Go ahead." "When he followed you to the back," Daniel said, choosing his words carefully, "why didn't you call us immediately?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, then back up. "Because escalation has a cost," she said, "and I was still deciding who should pay it." Daniel held her gaze. Something about that answer settled him. "You're very controlled." "I had to be," Margaret replied. "For a long time." Another pause. The co-pilot shifted in his seat, but said nothing. Daniel nodded once. "Ground security has completed their intake. Mr. Hale is being escorted off the property." Margaret absorbed that without reaction. "Good." "There's something else," Daniel said. "The flight plan." Margaret waited. "We can attempt departure again, once cleared," he said. "But with the delay, we risk missing the arrival slot on the west coast. That means holding in the air. Fuel margins remain acceptable, but it will be tight." Margaret closed her eyes, briefly calculating. Time zones, connections, the meeting that had already been moved once. She could feel the headache throb again, sharper now. She opened her eyes. "What's the alternative?" Daniel hesitated. "We could remain here until a new window opens. That could take hours." The weight of the decision settled into the small space. Outside, thunder rolled distantly, a reminder that control was always partial. Margaret nodded. "Then we wait." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You're certain?" "Yes." He studied her face, searching for doubt. Finding none. "Very well." As she stood to leave, Daniel spoke again. "Miss Lewis." She paused. "I don't know what your work is," he said, "but you handled this with restraint. Not everyone does." Margaret met his gaze. Restraint is a luxury, she said. One you earn by surviving without it. She stepped back into the cabin, the door sealing softly behind her. The air out here felt thicker, now charged with anticipation. Susan was waiting just outside, concern etched into her face. "How did it go?" Susan asked quietly. Margaret adjusted the strap of her bag. "We're waiting." Susan nodded. "I'll let the others know." As Margaret moved back toward the rear, she felt the eyes again. This time they followed her openly. Curiosity had edged into something else. Deference, maybe. Or confusion. People sensed that lines had been crossed, that rules they thought they understood had shifted. The man in the charcoal sweater watched her pass, his brow furrowed. When she reached her seat, he spoke, voice low. "Ma'am." Margaret turned. "I just wanted to say," he hesitated, then pushed through. "I should have said something sooner." "I saw what he did." Margaret studied him. She saw the discomfort, the shame, the relief of having finally spoken. "You spoke when it mattered," she said. He swallowed. "Still." Margaret nodded once. "Still." He sat back, exhaling as if a weight had lifted. The cabin settled again. Susan made an announcement, explaining the delay in neutral terms, citing weather and operational checks. No mention of the incident. No names. Passengers accepted it with weary nods. Some sighs, a few quiet complaints that went nowhere. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the hum of the aircraft wash over her. She felt the ache in her shoulders, the fatigue she'd been ignoring for days. She thought of the board members waiting on the other coast, already forming narratives. She thought of the call she would eventually have to make. She also thought of Richard Hale, standing somewhere beyond the glass, convinced this was a temporary setback, that it would pass. Men like him always believed that. Susan returned with a blanket, placing it gently over Margaret's shoulders without asking. Margaret opened her eyes, surprised. "You looked cold," Susan said. "Thank you," Margaret replied. Susan hesitated. "If you need anything," Margaret nodded, "I will let you know." Minutes stretched into an hour. The rain eased, then returned in waves. Ground crews moved around the plane, orange vests flashing like signals. The runway lights flickered on as the morning dimmed into something heavier. Margaret's phone buzzed softly in her pocket. She ignored it. Then it buzzed again. And again. She opened it, finally glancing at the screen. Missed calls. Messages. The first ripples were reaching the shore. She locked the screen without responding and slipped the phone back into her pocket. The plane remained still. But the story was moving now, gathering momentum threads, tightening around decisions already made. Margaret leaned back, eyes forward, breathing slow and steady. Whatever came next, she would meet it standing. The call came through the cockpit before it reached anyone else, a low chime that cut through the steady hum of auxiliary power. Captain Mercer glanced at the display, then at the rain-smeared windshield, his jaw tightening just enough to signal a shift. He pressed the headset closer to his ear, listening, asking a single question, then nodding once, as if the person on the other end could see him. Susan felt it before she heard it. Years in aviation had tuned her body to changes in pressure, in tone, in timing. She straightened near the galley as the cockpit door opened again, Daniel stepping out with a look that wasn't urgency, but certainty. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice came over the intercom moments later. Calm and precise, we are receiving updated instructions from operations. Please remain seated. A few passengers exchanged looks. One man sighed loudly, rubbing his temples. A woman checked her watch and shook her head. No one complained out loud. Not after what they had already witnessed. Margaret sat still, the blanket folded neatly over her lap hands, resting on top of it. She had not moved in nearly an hour. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket, persistent now, but she let it go. Whatever was unfolding would do so on its own timeline. She had learned long ago that reacting too quickly only fed the wrong narratives. Susan approached her quietly. "Ms. Lewis," she said, keeping her voice low. "Operations is requesting confirmation from the primary account holder." Margaret looked up, eyes clear. "About what?" "The continuation of the flight," Susan said, "and authorization for additional ground time." Margaret nodded once. "Tell them they have it." Susan hesitated just a fraction. "They'll want verbal confirmation." Margaret stood smoothing the front of her coat. "Then I'll give it." The movement drew attention again. Heads turned. Whispers followed her steps toward the front, softer this time, edged with speculation. She could almost hear the questions forming. Primary account holder, authorization, ground time. The pieces were beginning to rearrange themselves in other people's minds. The cockpit door closed behind her with a muted click. Daniel turned in his seat, meeting her gaze without surprise. "They're asking for confirmation," he said. Margaret reached into her pocket and removed a slim card, placing it on the console between them, black, unmarked except for a small embossed logo in the corner. Daniel glanced at it, then did a double take, his eyes narrowing slightly, as recognition set in. "Lewis Aerospace," he said quietly. Margaret didn't respond. Daniel picked up the card, turning it once, then again, as if the physical weight of it mattered. He looked back at her. Something new in his expression now. Not shock. Understanding. "I see," he said. "You were always authorized to make the call," Margaret replied. "This just makes the paperwork cleaner." Daniel nodded slowly. He keyed the radio. "Operations, this is Captain Mercer. Account holder confirmed. Proceed as discussed." The response crackled back. Affirmative. Formal. Careful. As Margaret turned to leave, Daniel spoke again. "Ms. Lewis." She paused. "There will be follow-up," he said. "From legal. From the charter company." Margaret met his eyes. There always is. She stepped back into the cabin, the door sealing behind her, cutting off the low murmur of the cockpit. The atmosphere out here had changed. It was subtle but unmistakable. People weren't just watching now. They were recalculating. Susan followed her out, tablet in hand expression, composed but eyes bright with something like restrained awe. She didn't say anything as they walked, but when Margaret reached her seat, Susan stopped beside her. "I didn't realize," Susan said softly. Margaret looked up. "That's by design." Susan nodded, absorbing that. "We'll be ready when you are." Margaret settled back into her seat. The blanket slid slightly, and she adjusted it without thinking. The ache behind her eyes had dulled into something manageable. Familiar. She had operated through worse. The intercom chimed again. Daniel's voice carried through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are coordinating a revised departure plan. Further updates shortly." A man near the aisle leaned toward his companion. "Did you hear that?" The companion nodded. "Something's going on." Margaret closed her eyes briefly, then opened them, gazing out the window. The rain had slowed to a mist, the runway lights glowing softer now, less harsh. Ground crews moved with purpose below their motions, efficient practiced, systems adjusting, plans shifting. Her phone buzzed again. She took it out this time, glancing at the screen. A name flashed there, one she hadn't seen in months. She let it ring out, then silenced the phone and slipped it back into her pocket. Not yet. Susan moved through the cabin, offering water, checking belts, murmuring reassurances. Her movements were calm, but her mind raced. She replayed the moment in the cockpit, the card on the console, the captain's reaction. She had served heads of companies before, flown celebrities, politicians, names, people recognized instantly. Margaret Lewis hadn't needed recognition. She carried authority like a quiet current, invisible, until it pulled you under. The man in the charcoal sweater watched Margaret from 2 rows up, his expression, thoughtful, now troubled. He leaned back and stared at the ceiling, jaw tight. The image of Richard being escorted off, replayed in his mind, layered now with new context. He wondered how many times he had stayed silent in rooms where silence had done harm. Minutes passed. Then more. The cabin remained settled, but the tension hadn't dissipated. It had transformed, sharpened, focused on the front of the plane, on the woman who had said so little and altered so much. A message appeared on Susan's tablet. She read it, blinked, then looked toward Margaret again. She walked over, crouching slightly to keep her voice low. "Ms. Lewis," she said, "Operations has requested a brief delay before departure." Margaret looked at her. "Reason?" "There's been an update regarding Mr. Hale." Susan said. Margaret's expression didn't change. "What kind of update?" "Legal," Susan replied. "And press?" Margaret exhaled slowly through her nose. That was fast. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret leaned back, eyes lifting to the ceiling. The story was already escaping the confines of the aircraft, finding new air, new ears. It always did. She thought of the meeting waiting on the other coast, the questions that would come before she even sat down. She thought of the call she had ignored. She opened her eyes. "How long is the delay?" "Approximately 20 minutes, Susan said. Margaret nodded. "That's acceptable." Susan hesitated. "Is there anything you'd like us to do in the meantime?" Margaret considered that, then shook her head. "Let things unfold." Susan stood straightening her uniform. "Understood." As she walked away, Margaret felt the weight of what was coming settle more fully. The incident was no longer contained. It was becoming a mirror, reflecting more than just one man's behavior. It would invite opinions, judgments, sides. She rested her head back against the seat eyes, forward posture unchanged. The jet remained still, but momentum had shifted irreversibly. Whatever came next would not be about a seat or even a flight. It would be about who people believed and why. And Margaret Lewis had never relied on belief alone. The first headline broke before the plane ever left. The ground whispered into existence through phones held low and screens tilted away from prying eyes. Susan noticed it when a passenger across the aisle stiffened, thumb freezing mid-scroll breath, catching just slightly. The man didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The ripple moved faster than words. Margaret felt it too, not because she'd seen anything, but because the air in the cabin changed again. This time it wasn't tension. It was anticipation, the kind that came when a private moment escaped into the public world and began to mutate. Her phone buzzed once more. She took it out calmly, aware that eyes followed the motion. A single message preview glowed on the screen. "Have you seen this?" She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She slid the phone back into her pocket and returned her gaze to the window, where a service truck rolled past, tires hissing on wet concrete. Susan approached again, slower now, as if the space around Margaret required care. "Ms. Lewis," she said quietly, "we've been advised that media inquiries are starting to come in." Margaret nodded. They will. The charter company is preparing a holding statement, Susan added. They're asking if you'd like to review it. Margaret considered that. The default response would be silence. Silence protected until it didn't. She weighed the options with the same instinct she used in negotiations, feeling for the moment when withholding became surrender. Tell them to hold, she said. For now. Susan nodded, relief flickering across her face. Yes, ma'am. 2 rows ahead, the woman who'd been dabbing her eyes earlier leaned toward her seatmate. I think that was her, she whispered, not as gossip, but as realization. Her seatmate frowned. Her who? The woman from the news, the first woman said. The one with the logistics company. I saw her picture once. She doesn't look like I expected. Margaret heard none of it directly, but she sensed the shape of the conversation. She had lived with that dissonance her entire life. Expectations versus reality. People searching for markers that matched the story they wanted to tell themselves. The cockpit door opened again briefly, and Captain Mercer stepped into the aisle. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. He walked straight toward Margaret, posture, steady expression, neutral. Conversations died around him. Ms. Lewis, he said quietly, stopping beside her seat. We've been cleared for departure in approximately 15 minutes. Margaret looked up at him. Thank you. There's one more thing, Daniel said. He lowered his voice further. Operations has confirmed that Mr. Hale has contacted counsel. There may be statements made that mischaracterize the incident. Margaret absorbed that. Of course. Daniel hesitated. If that happens, we'll support the crew account. I expect you will, Margaret said. That's all I ask. Daniel nodded once and returned to the cockpit. The man in the charcoal sweater watched the exchange, his unease deepening into something like awe. He leaned back and whispered to his wife, I think she's the one they listened to. His wife didn't answer right away. She stared at Margaret, then said softly, I think she's the one they should have listened to a long time ago. Margaret shifted slightly in her seat, adjusting the blanket again. Her thoughts had turned inward now, tracing paths she hadn't expected to revisit today. She thought of the first company she'd founded, decades earlier, out of a rented office, with flickering lights and a phone that rarely rang. She thought of the men who had spoken over her in meetings, dismissed her forecasts, laughed when she insisted on redundancy plans that later saved entire operations. She thought of how often she'd been told to wait her turn. Susan's tablet chimed. She glanced at it, then back toward Margaret, uncertainty crossing her face. She approached again, kneeling slightly to keep her voice contained. Ms. Lewis, she said, the holding statement has leaked. Margaret's eyes narrowed just a fraction. Leaked how? Someone shared it before it was finalized, Susan said. It's vague, but it names you. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, her voice was calm. Then it's already out of our control. Susan swallowed. They're asking if you want to issue your own statement. Margaret considered that, feeling the weight of timing settle fully now. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, even if she hadn't known it yet. Not the confrontation, not the removal. This. Yes, she said, finally, but not yet. Susan nodded, trusting her without fully understanding why. Understood. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as systems prepared for departure. A low hum returned as power shifted. People straightened in their seats, instinctively preparing. The storm outside had thinned to a light drizzle, the sky lifting just enough to reveal a pale strip of horizon. Margaret's phone buzzed again. This time she took it out deliberately and opened the message. A single link stared back at her, followed by 3 words. They're framing it. She clicked the link. The article loaded slowly, images flickering into place. The headline was careful, ambiguous, just provocative enough to invite speculation. A disruptive incident aboard a private charter. Sources claimed a disagreement over seating escalated. An unnamed executive allegedly used influence to delay a flight. Margaret read it once. Then again. She noted what was missing. Context, sequence, cause. She locked the screen and set the phone on her lap. The urge to correct the record rose sharply, but she held it down. This wasn't the moment to respond. This was the moment to let the story overreach. Susan watched her, reading the stillness as intention rather than passivity. She leaned in. "We can push back," she said quietly. "Now." Margaret shook her head. "If we do it now, it becomes an argument. And if we wait, it becomes evidence," Margaret said. Susan absorbed that, eyes widening slightly. "You're certain?" "Yes." The engines began to spool a rising whine that vibrated through the cabin floor. Seatbelts chimed softly. A few passengers startled, then settled. The plane was finally moving forward again, inching toward the runway as if nothing had happened. Margaret felt the forward motion and allowed herself a slow breath. Not relief. Readiness. The man in the charcoal sweater leaned toward the aisle again, hesitant. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, "I don't know if this helps, but if anyone asks, I'll tell them what I saw." Margaret turned to him. She saw the sincerity there, the quiet resolve that came too late to stop the harm, but not too late to matter. "Thank you," she said. "That does help." He nodded, swallowing hard. The plane turned onto the active runway. The lights stretched ahead, bright and unwavering. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady and professional. "Cabin crew prepare for departure." Susan took her seat, strapping in, eyes forward. Her pulse was steady, but her mind raced. She knew now that this flight would be remembered long after it landed. Not for where it went, but for what it carried with it. Margaret closed her eyes as the engines roared to full power. The force pressed her back into the seat, familiar and grounding. She felt the plane lift wheels leaving the ground, gravity loosening its hold. As the city fell away beneath them, Margaret opened her eyes and stared straight ahead. The narrative was already forming beyond the clouds, shaped by people who hadn't been there, who hadn't heard the words or seen the kick or felt the silence that followed. She let it form. Truth had momentum too. And when it caught up, it did not slow down. Altitude smoothed the chaos below the clouds, flattening into a pale, endless sheet as the jet climbed west. The cabin settled into the quiet rhythm of flight, a low vibration underfoot, a steady breath through vents, the muted clink of glass somewhere up front. What had been sharp now felt contained, but not resolved. Not even close. Margaret watched the wingtip cut a clean line through thinning cloud sunlight, flashing briefly off metal before disappearing again. The blanket still rested across her lap. She folded it once, neatly, then set it aside. The ache behind her eyes had receded to a distant throb. Enough clarity returned for work, enough distance for judgment. Susan moved through the aisle, voice low, movement sufficient. When she reached Margaret, she paused without speaking a silent question. Margaret nodded. Susan handed her a tablet. "Operations compiled the timeline," Susan said softly. "Crew statements, camera markers. They've time-stamped everything." Margaret accepted the tablet and scrolled. The footage thumbnails were small, clinical. A sequence of moments that, when stitched together, told a story no headline could distort without tearing itself apart. She didn't watch yet. She didn't need to. She noted the timestamps, the angles, the redundancy. She handed the tablet back. "Keep it sealed," Margaret said. "No previews, no excerpts." Susan nodded. "Legal agrees." "Good." A man a few rows ahead leaned back and closed his eyes, relief evident in the slack of his shoulders. His wife rested her head against the window. Others pretended to nap. No one truly did. Too many thoughts, too many recalculations. Margaret's phone vibrated again. This time she didn't ignore it. She read the message, then the next, then the next. Names attached. Familiar ones. People who knew how this game worked and had already chosen a side based on convenience. She set the phone face down. She thought of the board waiting in California. She could picture the room, the polished table, the practiced concern. She knew who would ask about risk, who would ask about optics, who would say nothing but watch closely. She had built that room. It would not surprise her. Susan returned with a glass of water and a folded napkin. "We'll be entering a smoother pocket shortly," she said, offering normalcy like an anchor. "Thank you," Margaret said. Susan hesitated, then spoke with care. "Captain asked if you'd like to brief him on next steps." Margaret considered. "Not yet." Susan accepted that. She always did. The man in the charcoal sweater stood and stretched, careful not to block the aisle. He glanced at Margaret, then spoke quietly, as if afraid of disturbing something delicate. "They're saying different things online," he said. "I saw 2 versions already." Margaret met his eyes. "That's how it starts." He nodded. "If they need me, I'm available." "I know," Margaret said. He returned to his seat posture, straighter than before. The jet leveled off. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady, and practiced welcoming them to cruise. The cabin lights softened. A few passengers ordered drinks. Someone laughed too loudly, then stopped, embarrassed. Life resumed its shape around the incident, but the shape had changed. Margaret took out her phone again and opened a note. She didn't type. She dictated voice low, precise, the words forming without hesitation. She stopped, listened, then deleted the draft. Not yet. The timing still wasn't right. She closed her eyes and let memory surface uninvited. Another flight years ago. Another seat taken without asking. A different man, a different plane. No cameras then. No witnesses willing to speak. She had swallowed it because the cost of not swallowing felt too high. She had promised herself she would not keep paying that cost forever. Susan passed again, then stopped. "Ms. Lewis," she said, "we're receiving requests for comment from multiple outlets." Margaret opened her eyes. "Which ones?" Susan listed them. "Old names? Loud ones? One careful one?" Margaret nodded. "Tell them we'll respond after landing. And the charter company?" "Same." Susan smiled faintly. "Understood." The tablet chimed softly on Susan's belt. She glanced at it, then looked back at Margaret, brows lifting slightly. "There's also an internal inquiry from the partner firm." Margaret's gaze sharpened. "Already?" "Yes." "Good," Margaret said. "That means they're nervous." Susan didn't ask how she knew. She simply nodded and moved on. Margaret turned back to the window. The sky had deepened into a rich blue, the clouds below glowing faintly. Somewhere down there, a story was growing, legs walking into rooms where she was not present. She had learned long ago that chasing such stories only made them run faster. She would let it run. The captain emerged briefly from the cockpit, moving down the aisle with purpose. He stopped beside Margaret, voice low. "We're about halfway. Conditions are stable." "Thank you," Margaret said. He hesitated. "We have confirmation that Mr. Hale's counsel has contacted the charter company." Margaret's lips pressed together. As expected, they're requesting access to footage. Margaret looked up at him. "Denied." Daniel nodded. "That was my response." "Good," she said. "If they want it, they can ask a judge." Daniel held her gaze a moment longer. "You're very sure of your footing." Margaret considered that. "I've been walking this ground my entire career." He nodded once and returned to the cockpit. The cabin dimmed further as the plane crossed into a different time zone. Margaret's phone buzzed again. This time, it was the call she'd been expecting. She answered without preamble. "Yes," she said. A voice responded, careful and measured. Margaret listened, saying nothing for a long moment. When she spoke again, her tone was level. "No, do not issue anything. Not a word. Let them overstate. Let them commit." Another pause. She ended the call and set the phone down. Susan noticed the change immediately. She approached, crouching slightly. "Is everything all right?" Margaret met her eyes. "Everything is on schedule." Susan nodded, trusting that more than she understood it. A few seats back, a woman whispered to her companion, "I think she's waiting." Her companion nodded. For what? For the truth to catch up. Margaret heard the cadence, not the words. She allowed herself a small exhale. Not relief. Alignment. She reached for the tray table and opened her laptop. The screen glowed softly. She pulled up a secure folder and reviewed a checklist. Names, dates, agreements. She added one more item to the list, then closed it. Outside, the sun dipped lower, the sky darkening by degrees. Inside the cabin breathed as one unaware of how close it was to the moment that would define this flight, far beyond its destination. Margaret folded her hands and waited. The boardroom overlooked the bay, glass stretching from floor to ceiling, the water below, reflecting a late afternoon sun that felt almost mocking in its calm. Margaret Lewis stood alone, at the head of the table jacket, off sleeves rolled once palms resting on polished wood that had seen decades of decisions made by men who assumed they would never be questioned. The room began to fill. Quiet footsteps, chairs sliding back, familiar faces took their places, some composed, some strained. These were people who measured risk for a living, who could smell volatility the way sailors smelled storms. They had smelled it hours ago. A screen at the far end flickered to life. Headlines scrolled silently, each one sharper than the last. Private jet incident raises questions. Executive power play delays flight. Sources dispute account. Margaret watched them read without comment. "Before we begin," said Thomas Riley, 70 years old, silver hair combed back, voice still carrying the authority of someone who had once been underestimated and never forgotten it. "We need clarity." Margaret nodded. "You will have it." A woman to his right leaned forward, fingers laced. "The press narrative is moving fast, faster than facts." "Which is normal," Margaret replied. A man across the table exhaled. "They're painting it as a personality issue." Margaret looked at him. It wasn't. Silence followed. Not awkward. Attentive. "Let's walk through it," Thomas said. "From your perspective?" Margaret did not sit. She stayed standing, grounding herself. The incident began before the aircraft left the ground. A passenger forcibly displaced me from my assigned seat. He followed me to the rear cabin and kicked my personal property. That behavior was witnessed, recorded, and reported by crew. A murmur moved through the room. "He has retained counsel," someone said. I expected that, Margaret replied. "They're claiming provocation," another added. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. There was none. Thomas nodded slowly, And the footage? Margaret reached into her bag and removed a slim drive, placing it on the table. The sound it made against the wood was small but decisive. This contains the complete cabin recording, time-stamped, redundant angles, audio intact. A woman near the screen stiffened. "You have everything." "Yes," Margaret said. "Thomas didn't touch the drive." "And you haven't released it?" "Not yet." "Why?" Margaret folded her hands. "Because if we release it now, it looks defensive. If we wait, it becomes definitive." The room went still. The older members exchanged glances. They understood that calculus. They had lived it. "They're escalating," the woman said. He gave an interview. Margaret inclined her head. "I know. He named you. I know. He claimed you abused authority." Margaret allowed herself a single breath. "Then he has committed to that story." Thomas's eyes sharpened. "You're letting him?" "Yes." The silence stretched again, heavier now. This was the moment where reputations bent or broke. "Are you prepared for the fallout?" someone asked quietly. Margaret met their gaze. "I have been prepared for this my entire career." A screen lit up again, a new headline sliding into view. The room collectively leaned forward. The phrasing had shifted. "Alleged executive overreach now under review. Witnesses come forward." Margaret didn't react. She had expected the first cracks. Her phone vibrated. She glanced at it, then looked back up. "He's filing a civil complaint," she said calmly. "False detention, defamation." A sharp inhale came from the far end of the table. "On what basis?" Thomas asked. "He claims he lost a business opportunity due to the delay." Thomas let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Does he?" Margaret nodded. "Yes." "And did he?" "No." A pause. "The opportunity he claims to have lost," Margaret continued, "was never scheduled. The firm he says he was meeting declined his proposal 3 days prior." A woman across the table blinked. "How do you know that?" Margaret's voice remained steady. "Because that firm is a subsidiary we acquired last quarter." Quietly, the room erupted, then voices overlapping, chairs shifting. Surprise, admiration, disbelief all tangled together. Thomas raised a hand, commanding silence. "So he lied?" "Yes. And now he's doing it publicly." "Yes." Thomas leaned back, studying her. "You're letting him bury himself." Margaret nodded once. A younger board member frowned. "This is risky." Margaret turned to him. "So is silence. The difference is control." The screen chimed softly. Another update. This time a clip. Richard Hale's face filled the display expression, aggrieved voice, confident. He spoke of intimidation, of humiliation, of power wielded unfairly. Margaret watched without expression. Thomas broke the silence. "He's testifying to this version?" "Yes," Margaret said. "On record." A woman near the window whispered. "He's signing his name to it." Margaret's phone buzzed again. She checked it, then looked up. "Legal confirms he filed under oath." The room went very still. Thomas's voice was quiet now. "Then he's crossed a line." "Yes," Margaret said. She reached for the drive and slid it a few inches forward. "Now," she continued, "we release the footage. In full. No edits. No commentary." "And the press?" someone asked. "They'll do the rest," Margaret replied. Thomas nodded slowly. "You've waited him out." Margaret looked around the table, meeting each gaze in turn. "I didn't wait. I let him speak." A beat passed. Then Thomas smiled, thin and satisfied. "All right," he said. "Let's correct the record." Margaret finally sat down. Outside the bay reflected the first hints of evening. Inside, screens lit up as messages were sent, files transferred, statements prepared with careful precision. The truth, long restrained, was about to be set loose. Margaret folded her hands in front of her and waited just as she had on the plane, knowing that some forces didn't need to be rushed to be unstoppable. The video went live without fanfare, uploaded quietly to a corporate server that had never trended in its life. No teaser, no countdown, just a time-stamped file, labeled with a date and a flight number, released into a digital world that never slept and never forgot. Within minutes, the narrative cracked. At first it was slow. A few reposts, a handful of comments from people who actually watched instead of skimmed. Then the audio hit. Clear. Undeniable. Richard Hale's voice, sharp with entitlement, slicing through the cabin. The kick, the dull thud of leather against metal. The stunned silence afterward. The calm request to sit down. The refusal. The escalation. The authority of the captain. The consequences. There was no music, no captions telling people how to feel. The footage didn't need help. By the time the clip reached mainstream platforms, the story had already turned. Headlines were rewritten in real time. Words like alleged vanished, replaced by confirmed. Anonymous sources dissolved under the weight of recorded fact. Commentators who had rushed to fill airtime hours earlier now backtracked, coughed, reframed. Margaret Lewis watched none of it. She sat alone in her office, long after the board had adjourned the city outside her window, glowing as evening settled in. Her jacket hung neatly on the back of the chair. Her shoes were kicked off beneath the desk. She held a mug she hadn't touched in several minutes, the coffee inside gone cold. Her phone vibrated constantly now. Messages stacked on messages. Apologies from people who had been silent earlier. Invitations from outlets that had ignored her work for decades. Statements from firms distancing themselves from Richard Hale with impressive speed. She didn't answer most of them. Across the country, Richard watched the same video from a very different room. The confidence he'd carried into the day was gone, replaced by a hollow stillness. His lawyer had stopped returning calls an hour ago. The interview he'd given that morning, replayed on a muted television, his own words now weaponized against him. Every version of the story he'd told had collapsed into the same truth. And the truth had receipts. By morning, his firm issued a statement. Effective immediately, terminated for cause, no severance, no farewell. His access badge deactivated before he could reach the building. Security escorted him out with a cardboard box that held a framed photo, a mug, and nothing else of value. The civil complaint he'd filed was withdrawn before it ever saw a courtroom. The criminal review did not move as quickly. Federal agencies tended to take their time. They also tended not to forget sworn statements, contradicted by evidence. Margaret read the updates the way she read weather reports. Informational. Necessary. Not personal. A week later, she boarded another flight. Different aircraft. Different crew. Same quiet efficiency. She took her seat without incident, placing her bag at her feet, fastening her belt, as the engines spooled. No one pointed. No one questioned. A few people recognized her. Now glances lingering a second longer than before, but no one spoke. Susan Carter wasn't on this flight, but another attendant moved down the aisle with the same practiced calm. The system, Margaret knew, was larger than any one person. So was the damage when it failed. So was the repair. As the plane lifted into clear air, Margaret closed her eyes and allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. Not on the headlines, not on the fallout. On the quiet choice she'd made hours earlier, standing in the aisle of a grounded jet when she decided not to explain herself to a man who had already decided who she was. She thought of all the moments she hadn't had cameras, of all the times silence had been mistaken for permission. She thought of the man who had finally spoken up, voice shaking, choosing truth over comfort, of the captain who had drawn a line and held it, of the attendant who had done her job even when it would have been easier not to. The plane leveled out. Sunlight poured through the window clean and bright. Margaret opened her eyes and looked out at the horizon, where sky met cloud in a line so clear it felt intentional. She knew there would be another version of this story someday. Different names, different setting, same pattern. Power assumed, dignity tested, truth delayed. But she also knew this. Silence was no longer the default, not hers, not anyone's if they learned to recognize the moment when patience stopped being virtue and became surrender. The aircraft moved steadily forward, unbothered by the noise it had left behind. Margaret rested her hands on the armrests, breathing evenly grounded in the knowledge that she hadn't raised her voice, hadn't demanded respect, hadn't chased validation. She had simply stayed where she belonged. If this story moved, you take a moment to like and subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments with 3 simple words: speak your truth.